Hi and welcome to The Courageous Collective, the podcast where we celebrate diverse women who dare to do things differently. I'm Rupa and Vardeep, a copywriter and communication specialist. I work with women entrepreneurs to help them get clear on their brand messaging, and I help them become more visible to their target customers using PR.
And I'm Vardeep Edwards, founder of The Branding Fox, a design consultancy that supports women in business with their branding and design needs. After working in corporate roles, we both took the leap into self-employment and created our own businesses where our skills and experience could really shine. But something we both noticed was the lack of women that looked like us at events, on speaker panels and in the media.
Which is why we created the Courageous Collective podcast. This is our platform to celebrate and champion diverse women who are smashing it in their businesses. In each episode, we speak to a female founder about the story behind their business. We explore their inspirations, the challenges they faced and how they've dealt with them. And we talk about what they're yet to achieve.
Welcome to the Courageous Collective and enjoy today's episode. Hi and welcome to the Courageous Collective podcast. Just a quick reminder for you to give us a review as this helps us to secure more great guests. And please do follow us on Instagram. We are at _courageous_collective. So this week we're talking about personal brand. It might be a topic you've heard about before, especially if you're a business founder. But let's look at what personal branding is, how it can help you, and in particular as being a woman of colour business founder. And let's get cracking. Well, Rupa, what does personal branding mean to you?
It's such a good topic, I think, for us to crack on with because there's so much noise about personal brand. I think there's been a lot of noise about personal brand for quite some time now. And for me, it means so much more than just who you are. For me, I think I read this quote somewhere and I've seen it kind of replicated in lots of different places. But for me, it's what people say about you when you're not in the room. It's about presenting yourself in that best possible way so that they are saying those amazingly great things about you. And the way that you can do that is by projecting an image of yourself, which is, that calling it a secret sauce, but it could be kind of a culmination of all the things that make you you. So, your skills, your experiences, your personality traits, your background, your identity, basically, bringing all of those things together, plus the things that you do for your clients, how do you define the value that you bring? And it's really about, I hate the word strategy or kind of even strategic because I think it sometimes maybe overcomplicates things, but really simply, how do you want your audience to feel, think about you? And how can you then use that to build authentic relationships with them? How about you, Vardeep? What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think it's definitely been a term that's been used more and more in recent years. And I think part of the reason for that is the rise of online spaces and online world and online businesses. The fact that anybody can set up an online shop website these days and start a business, there's a lot more scope for building a brand as well as a personal brand as well. So I think for me, at a very basic level, is being strategic. You're like that. And it is that creation and curation of what your professional identity is. I think, pre-online spaces, we had that when we went for job interviews or when you went and worked somewhere, if you were a freelancer. And it's the same principle because it's how you're presenting yourself and how, you want to be come across and what impression you want to leave with other people. And that's the whole point of branding, those associations. So it's just being a little bit more, intentional with that impression that you want to leave. I do think there's not a lot of information for individual different groups of people and, for the purposes of our podcast, women of colour. And I think that does need to be taken into consideration because a lot of the personal branding advice and information that I come across is quite generic. And it will be written by somebody who's got their own slant and take on, one, what personal branding is, as well as what it means for them on a more individual personal level. So I do think as women of colour, we would have different upbringing, background, culture, life experiences, identity, and these all come into play with who we are as a personal brand. It also taps a little bit into subconscious bias that we might have about ourselves, as well as what other people might have about us with our background. You know, we're making judgment on everyone, and it's not just towards women of colour. We also are doing it towards other people as well. So yeah, what would you say are the benefits then, Rupa, of having a strong personal brand?
I think there's lots. There's lots of potential benefits. I think it's easier for your audience to understand who you are, what you stand for. If you have a really good, strong personal brand, you know, it's quite obvious who you are. If somebody's scrolling through Instagram, they instantly know that that's you. So you're kind of more recognizable, I guess, more memorable as a result. What you were there just talking about, you know, in terms of women of color as well, you know, I think we have such distinct experiences that when I hear or see somebody's, you know, sharing a story that kind of taps into my own background or experience, it does unlock a memory or something in me. And I think that's really, it's lovely, and it actually helps me connect with that person. So I think, you know, a really good benefit is actually being able to connect with people on kind of more of a, I guess, deep and meaningful, you know, way, rather than kind of more on an aesthetic kind of way, which doesn't really get you very far. So I think by tapping into a strong personal brand, you can actually have that much more deeper kind of meaningful connections with your audience. And I think one thing that I've realized is it can make you more consistent as well, which is not a bad thing. I think we're all striving to be more consistent, whether that's just showing up, whether that's, you know, how much we're posting on social media or going to kind of regular networking events. I think once you start building a personal brand, it becomes that much more easier to then be consistent. What do you reckon, Vardeep?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that connection piece is really important, because that is what's going to draw people into your world and your story.
Yeah.
If you know that, you know, people are going to relate to you on some sort of level, then that's going to help build your personal brand, because the idea of building a personal brand is to be known, and to be known for something. So yeah, absolutely. So leaning on those individual points and what's, you know, unique about you in terms of your story and experiences is then what's going to help connect with other people, perhaps, you know, who've got a bit of an overlap in terms of that experience. And I don't know about you, but I've got an example of somebody that I quite like with a strong personal brand.
Yes.
And that is Anita Rani for me. She's been, I don't know how long she's been a radio and TV presenter for now, but she's been, you know, she's been there for a little while. But I totally identify with her on the connection points that you've just spoken about. She's from a South Asian background. She embraces her culture and identity, but in a way that feels authentic and doesn't feel forced. So it's just, I feel like she's communicating and highlighting those parts of her, but it's not everything about her. So it's the way it fits in with who she is as a personal brand and character and personality. And I like that, you know, I like that mix of what that means to be who she is in the world and in terms of her job and what she does. It's also been highlighted in some of her content online, as well as some of her programs that has highlighted her heritage. I think she went back and there was a program where she went back to India, and there was a lot of talk about partition, and she met, you know, and spoke to lots of different people about that. And one of the things that came out of that, which I really liked, is our story is your story. And I really like that kind of aspect of it, because all our stories are kind of intermingled. You know, we've all got a crossover and connection somewhere. So I think the other thing about that in terms of her story and what she brings out is it brings out her values and what's important to her. So you get to understand what she's about. And I think stories and your personal brand are intertwined really in terms of that. It's got to be authentic to you. But it is, your story is going to help build your personal brand. So I think she does a really good example. Do you have anyone, Rupa?
Yeah, just agree as well. I think Anita's a brilliant example. I think she was on Who Do You Think You Are? Is that the program you're talking
possibly
about? Yeah, and it was just fascinating to kind of understand because again, with those kind of programs, you don't always see women like us on those programs. Then to see her go back to India and to discover stuff about her past and her family and all of the things that she talked about was incredible. And actually, you're right, it definitely makes you feel that it is your story as much as it is her story. So my example is Candice Brathwaite. She is a Black influencer, writer and podcast host. She's written a number of books. I love her because she is unashamedly herself. I feel the way that she writes, the way that she speaks, it's consistent across all of her platforms. She doesn't apologize for who she is, what she stands for. She is championing Black women. And, even when we talk about, Black women or women of color, there's also colorism in that whole, makeup as well. So she actually talks about that and the fact that actually, the darker skinned you are, the probably more likely you're going to suffer prejudice and, have more challenges, which I think is so refreshing because I don't think those conversations are still being had. So she brings that to the core and she does that on Instagram really well. But she also loves fashion and I just love the fact that she intermixes her values, who she is, with things that she loves, and she really kind of draws you in on her journey, which is really nice. She shares stories of her past and present, again, a bit like Anita Rani, you feel like you know her, but actually she's just showing you such a small kind of window into her life. It's not like she's taking the camera with her everywhere all the time. It's kind of very kind of now and again. And I feel like I identify with the things that she talks about as well. So she kind of gives these teaching moments, which I don't think she ever planned to do, but it's kind of evolved as her brand has evolved. And even some of the things that she talks about, she's on this journey to kind of discover fitness, and she talks about how it's always been quite a struggle for her, but mind over matter, building consistent habits, all of those things. So I like the fact that she shares her insights. It's not just a case of she's selling to you or anything like that. She's actually bringing you in on the journey, which is really, really powerful. So they're two really great examples of women of color with strong personal brands. So how does personal branding differ for women of color business founders compared to, say, other business founders? Is that an actual thing, do you think?
Do you know what? I didn't really realise it might have been a thing until, I kind of did a bit more research and reading around this topic as well. Because we have got different stories. We've all got different stories, regardless of your background and culture and your heritage. And it's about leaning into that and what that means for you as a business founder and a person, in this space that we're kind of navigating. And what I find interesting sometimes is that, depending on what your background or upbringing might have been, and this could be regardless of what background you've come from, maybe there's been a bit of a prejudice against women aren't allowed to speak out or shouldn't be seen to be speaking out. And I just know from personal experience, there is a little bit of that in my wider community growing up, not so much now, but definitely, say, grandparents' generation. They weren't supposed to. The women were supposed to be bold and confident and speak out. And it was the men, the men ruled. The men had the voices. They were the community leaders. They were the ones that people looked up to within, whatever community or circle or network that you are in. So I think there is a difference. And I do wonder if any of that sometimes has carried through, because we would all kind of, as generations develop, I think you pass down your own upbringing, don't you? Your values and your stories and what is important to you, what you think, that your sibling, your children should be sort of thinking about and taken into consideration. So, I definitely think there's something there in terms of drawing on what your individual personal brand is and what that means for your particular background and heritage, culture and identity. And it's part of our story, and it's bringing that out. So it's not a case of hiding it to try and make it fit what we think this personal brand and this story should be, because of lots of other experts telling us what that needs to be in the online or in the business space. Like those two examples we've shown, nobody else can replicate that. And that's the beauty of creating a personal brand. And I think, to use that then, your own story and your individuality and your own personality is really going to help to make that stronger. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think definitely the generational kind of, passing things down, and I 100% agree with that. And I still think that even though, I'm 40 plus years old and, you're still constantly battling with those things that you were told maybe as a child, or even if you weren't necessarily told overtly, you saw things and you saw, it was always the men who wouldn't necessarily be in the kitchen and the women would be the ones in the kitchen, they'd be last to eat. Or the fact that, if I was out in the garden and messing around with my cousins who were mostly male, who were kind of my age, I would be the one that would get told off because I was the one swinging off a climbing frame, whereas for them it was okay. So I feel like that whole kind of, the gender stereotypes that we were maybe subjected to as young kind of, children, I feel like they do carry, with us as we get older. But actually, the other thing I would say as well is that maybe previously, definitely when I was growing up and maybe, early parts of my career, I was really I didn't really talk about my background or my story. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't that it wasn't necessarily acceptable, but it wasn't as easy to have those conversations, whereas now it's very different. And, you can turn on the TV or you can watch something and you can see people of all different experiences talking about quite, personal experiences and things that they've kind of grown up with. But I remember vividly when I first started started my working life, I was mainly in offices where the dominant, group was white men. And actually to then, when you think about all the intersectionalities that I was bringing, female, the fact that I was a woman of colour, first generation born in the UK, all these different things, I didn't feel comfortable or confident to even talk about them. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that's okay. Whereas now I feel like I do have the confidence to talk about some of these things, hence why we're doing this podcast for a start. But actually, I think you can build that confidence as you go on. And, sharing your stories is one way of doing that if you feel obviously comfortable. I think, these stories that we have as women of colour do make us unique, do make us memorable. But I don't think you should be necessarily sharing them for the sake of it as well. I think there has to be some form of relevance while you're doing it. I think it's, again, going back to that word of being strategic, what is it that you want to enable your audience to feel, think, do, when they hear about these things that you want to share. So I think being really clear on who your audience is really important. But I definitely think that it can help set us apart, as business founders. So how do you think women of colour can leverage their unique experiences and perspectives to build a strong brand?
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it, what you're saying about what is relevant, because I think that authenticity piece is really key. So it is about, I think, it is about looking at what the impression is that you want to leave in your working and sort of professional space, and what's actually authentic and then relevant as well to match that. And that's going to give you that depth to kind of draw on, I would say. So it's not a case of sort of masking something or pretending to be something that you're not, but it's leaning into what makes you you, so that you come from that place of authenticity, and because people do connect with that subconsciously. So I think that needs to be a key element as well. But yeah, it's also, kind of leaning into your story and what your space is in terms of that place of belonging. Yeah, how about you, Rupa?
Yeah, I agree. I think embracing authenticity does allow you to have those deep and kind of meaningful connections with your audience, which you might not get otherwise. But I also think, as well as kind of, drawing on your kind of background and your heritage and your lived experiences, it's also looking at across the kind of across you really, and all the other things that you bring as well. So, you might be a parent, you might um, be a runner, you might be somebody who's interested in pottery, or, it's being clear on all those different things and bringing that kind of picture together. I don't think it's just a case of, focusing on one thing. I think it's giving that kind of expanse of who you are, and that will help you build authenticity. I also think, just based on what we've been speaking about in the last 20 minutes or so, when you hear stories that remind you of you, make you think of, your kind of growing up, or, your upbringing, I think it gives you that stronger connection. And that's down to belonging and feeling like you're not the only one. And I guess that's why we started this podcast. We were really quite sure that there were more women like us. And, we're two seasons in, we've spoken to lots of women now, and those experiences are really similar. They might not be the same, but they are really similar. And that makes us feel like we belong. And actually, it's given us a purpose as well, which is really nice. It makes us feel like we're part of something bigger. It's, that kind of feeling of being on your own, or it's horrible. And actually the reality is, there's so many people in the world. There's bound to be somebody who's got a similar story, or, similar upbringing to you. So I think it really does make a huge difference.
Yeah, so what role do you think community and networks play then in shaping and amplifying women of colour in businesses?
I didn't realise the power of community and networking, I'd say, until probably the last few years. I think, I was just talking about belonging, and I think, finding women, if I talk about from like our example, finding women like us has really unlocked so much, I don't know, just strong, important conversations that we probably wouldn't have been able to have anywhere else. And I still don't think where these conversations are necessarily happening, maybe behind closed doors, and we're not aware of it. But I think to this level where we're actually having conversations with women like us about topics that impact us, being able to talk to somebody about their journey of actually creating their business, from kind of the beginning and onwards, I think it's really powerful. I think when you share stories, it does give people the opportunity to maybe talk about themselves in a different way, which they might not have been able to do. So when you're in an environment where there's lots of women like that, I think it's such a powerful feeling to, again, feel like you're not on your own, that, these are shared experiences, and, together there's this kind of feeling of collective strength, which is so powerful. I think also we've spoken to so many guests about, being mentored, finding people who are kind of maybe further along in the journey than them. And I think when you are part of networks and communities and people who are on differing levels of their business journey, I think that again in itself is so inspiring. It's motivating, but it also shows you what you could achieve, aim for, not necessarily in the same way, but I think it gives you that motivation, inspiration to kind of head towards a similar path. So I think it's really powerful to find other women who are in maybe, a similar industry space, but also backgrounds and cultures and kind of heritage as well. I think that can play a massive role in kind of amplifying women of colour in business. What about you, Vardeep? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you were saying there about the identification is really important, because I know I've spoken about this before, but in terms of my industry, I didn't see any women who looked like me at all where I worked, in books, at my college and university. So, but I think that the key with that is not only is it good to see other people who look like you, but also similar life experiences as well. So I'm a mum, I work from home, I'm also a woman of colour, I've got a creative business, so I've got all these things come into play. And if I was to see another mum in a role, for example, in a similar sort of industry, I could see what possibly is achievable or how they're making it work for their individual life situation. So there's a lot of little pointers, aren't there? Because otherwise what happens, I think, sometimes is you're trying to sort of figure out how to make it work for you. So I think definitely having that variety within your community of the different experiences is really important. Definitely for that sense of belonging, because I think community is all about having a place of understanding. So, you've got people understand where you're coming from and you understand where they're coming from on whatever level that is. And I think that's a really key part, because the more you feel like you belong, the more likely you are to stay in that community and use it. But it's also the role models as well. So when you've got different people, maybe they look like you, or maybe they are in the same industry, or maybe they've got a similar life experience, you can start to see what that might mean for you on a personal level in terms of your career progression, or what you want to do, or how to make work for you. And I think I think the variety is key there, just to sort of so you're kind of ticking a lot of boxes for different people. And I think that's part of the point of our podcast, isn't it, as well? Because where we've grown up, we've seen a lot of the same type of people in positions of influence in our industry and careers, whereas the more varied it is, the more you've got to offer, I think, to a lot of other different people. So in terms of sort of practical side of things, Rupa, have you got any kind of storytelling techniques or approaches that you think would work particularly well for women of colour?
I think the storytelling is a really, powerful approach in the first instance. I think it's a great way of, as we said, building that deeper and meaningful connection with your audience. And one way to do that is to tell your brand origin story or your brand founder story. There's lots of ways, lots of names that it's given. But, understanding, being able to articulate, should I say, your story from kind of beginning to kind of current time, really. What was it that started you on this journey? Try and think of, usually what happens is people will maybe overcome adversity or some kind of challenge, or there'll be some kind of event that will happen in their lives, which may then, may lead them to create a business. So can you actually identify that and actually think about all those little moments that have led up to you building a business? And at the time of you doing this exercise, you might think, oh my God, there's nothing, in this, there's no story. But actually, I guarantee you that there will be elements of the story when you look back. And I think the reason for doing this, reason for sharing your story, it's really good to kind of have that down, because when you go to a podcast, or, if you want to consider getting PR, or if you, even use it for your own personal social media, it's a great way of sharing who you are and what you do with your audience, because it fosters empathy. I think it gives them an insight into who you are and what you do and why you do it. And hopefully it resonates with the audience as well. So, you're starting to kind of build that level of credibility, trust. All these things are coming together as you're sharing, your story. I also think that it's a great way for you to then think about the things along the way or along your journey that have then piqued your interest and kind of, don't want to get into kind of too much kind of technical detail, but there's content themes which you can then talk about in your social media, in your blog, on your website, whether you're speaking on a podcast. It gives you those, I guess, talking points which you want to be known for. And when it comes to gaining PR, for example, it's those talking points that make you unique, memorable, relevant. So yeah, I think storytelling is definitely a really powerful approach to use. What about you, Vardeep? What do you suggest people could do?
Yeah, I think it's really digging into a bit more about your why as well, why you're doing what you're doing. When I see strong brands or strong personal brands, there's always quite a strong purpose or reason behind why they're doing this business and why they're doing what they're doing. And looking into kind of what makes you, because again, you're kind of drawing into that thing that's only unique to you and that only you can own. And that's a really good place to put yourself in the market, especially against any competitors, because nobody else can own that. But yes, it needs to be relevant, but it needs to be authentic to you as well. Another way you can look at it is, what you're against. So sometimes we can think about what we're for and what we're interested in. But actually, sometimes if you're actually voicing about what you're against or what you're anti, can sometimes give you more of a story. And also it can just open your eyes to what's important to you, because it can be quite tricky to do sort of work on yourself. And it does take a bit of digging, and we're not objective. So it can be hard sometimes, tricky for us to find the answers to some of those things. So sometimes to kind of reverse it and just flip it and go, okay, well, what am I not for? What am I going to be completely against? It could be a really good way to look at it. And then it is about finding your voice. So we're the Courageous Collective, and we want more women of colour to share their stories. And part of that is so you can share and find your voice. And speak up about what's important to you. What is your story? What are you about? What are you for? And it's amplifying that and communicating that on a consistent basis, like you mentioned as well. And I think when you outline what you're about and what your personal brand is for, then when you communicate that and share it repeatedly, creates that consistency, and that's what you then get to know for as well. So we've spoken a bit about how we can build a personal brand, particularly for women of colour. What would be the next steps from that, do you think? What would we do once we've got some of this information?
Okay, so I'd probably suggest maybe 5 things. We could go on. This could just be a podcast in itself, just on this question. So I think the number one thing I would suggest you do is Google yourself if you don't already. I think I say this in every episode, but if you don't know what's out there when you Google, make sure you do that. Have a look and see the type of things that come up. Is it your website? Are you presenting yourself in the best possible way? Give that a go. maybe then do some of these exercises and then Google yourself again, maybe do this on a, maybe monthly or quarterly basis, just so that you are clear, you're putting your best foot forward online and in person. And I think you need to, by Googling yourself, you can kind of see what's out there. So step 2 is really defining your personal brand. I mean, we've spoken quite a lot about, what makes your personal brand, but do some exercises in terms of, identify your values if you don't have those already. What are your strengths, your passions, your USP, what makes you unique, and kind of go beyond that as well. We just talked about your background and experiences, your heritage, growing up, what was life like, write that founder story if you haven't already, because I think that's a really good way of putting it down on paper, and then actually it will give you so much more than just some words. I think you can really build so much more from that. The other thing I would suggest as well is to start writing or creating relevant content. So if you want to be known for a particular thing, start writing about that thing. If you have a particularly strong view, remember I was talking about talking points earlier, how can you develop that in your content? What can you talk about? Are you reading the newspapers and magazines? And, are there particularly industry magazines and websites that you should be checking and seeing what news is out there? Maybe you could kind of share that on your social media. The fifth or fourth step, can't remember where I'm at now, but consistency across all channels. We've talked about consistency quite a lot, so I won't kind of go into this, but the women of color that we shared earlier, with the strong personal brand. So Anita Rani, it's her because she'll maybe stick a selfie on, and she'll maybe post a picture from one of her Country File episodes, or it's quite clear who she is and what she's doing. She's not necessarily going to go left field and post something which is totally random. So be really clear on what you want to be sharing on those channels. And then I think the final thing is one that, I've only recently started doing this a bit more kind of, I guess, properly, is to consistently measure what you're doing across all of your all of your channels, and also, seeing what your target audience feel, think, do. Ask them if you haven't already, so maybe do some market research. But yeah, I think that continually testing ideas, seeing what's working, and then revisiting your goals is really important. What about you, Vardy? What do you think are the practical steps that women of colour can take?
Yeah, I think the photography one is really interesting because, because I don't see it getting spoken about quite as much actually in the personal branding space. And I think, you do tell a story with the photographs that you choose. So it does pay to use that as part of your personal brand, and look at what sort of story that you are actually telling with some of the photo and usage, and what sort of impression that might be giving. And also if it is in alignment with what you want to be projecting as well. So I think that's where having like a concrete thing of that, this is what my personal brand is about, and then looking at how to communicate that verbally through your messaging as well as through your photography is a way to then start, building that consistency as well. But, it is about, you don't need to share everything about yourself. It's only what's relevant. So it's a case of defining what is relevant for you, and how best to amplify and share that as well. Another good way to do this is to have it outlined in terms of a one-liner, for example, because when you're going to networking and you're meeting people and introducing people, you want to make sure that how you introduce yourself is in alignment with your personal brand and what impression you want to give out, and also what you want to be known for. So yeah, it kind of pays to kind of know what that one-liner is and how you want to introduce yourself, because that's the opening line, isn't it, with a lot of people. And, so I think it's quite a key part of building that personal brand. I think that finishes all my my steps and tips. I think we've covered quite a bit. Hopefully it's useful for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. So there's lots to think about, as you can tell, when it comes to personal brand. We don't want to just leave you there, though. We want to help you get started with your personal brand. So we've created a workbook, which you can find if you head to the show notes for a link that you can download. Give us your feedback. Let us know what you think. We would love to hear from you. And that's it for this week. If you don't already, as Vardeep said at the top of the show, you can follow us on Instagram. It's at the _ courageous _ collective. We'll be back with a new episode in a fortnight. So we will see you then.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. The Courageous Collective is created by Rupa and Vardeep Edwards. We really appreciate your feedback, so please like, share and follow us. Please also subscribe to receive an alert for our next episode.
You can find out where to follow us on social media in the show notes, and if you'd like to be a future guest, please do get in touch. Thanks and see you soon.